Mrs. Evelyn Carter woke up that morning just like any other Tuesday. The sun peeked through her lace curtains, casting soft stripes across her worn but clean quilt. At 78, her bones creaked a little more than they used to, but her mind was sharp. Sharper, she often joked, than most folks half her age. She'd been up since 6, made a pot of strong coffee, 2 sugars, splash of milk, and read the local paper from front to back, circling the grocery deals with a red pen like it was a sacred ritual. She lived alone now, ever since her husband passed 5 years back. Their little house on Sycamore Street still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and her gardenias, a quiet comfort. Her children lived in different states, busy with their own lives and grandkids, but they called every Sunday without fail. She never complained. She'd raised them to be independent, and she was proud of how they turned out. Still, some days, like today, felt a little heavier. Not sad, just quiet. She needed to go to the bank. Not for anything big. Just to take out $60 for groceries. Her Social Security check had come in, and she liked to keep most of it in savings, using only cash for weekly shopping. It helped her stick to her budget, and truth be told, she didn't trust those little plastic cards. If you can't hold it in your hand, she'd say, you don't really own it. She dressed carefully. Not fancy. She wasn't going to a wedding, but with the kind of care that said, I matter. A soft lavender blouse, her favorite navy skirt, low-heeled shoes that didn't pinch, and the pearl earrings her husband gave her on their 40th anniversary. She pinned her silver hair neatly at the back, dabbed a bit of rose-scented lotion on her wrists, and checked herself in the hallway mirror. All right, Evelyn, she whispered. You got this. The walk to the bank was only 10 minutes, but she took her time. She waved to Mrs. Jenkins, watering her roses next door, nodded at the young man delivering packages down the block, and paused to watch a pair of sparrows chase each other through the oak trees. Life moved slow in her neighborhood, and she liked it that way. When she reached the bank, a squat brick building with glass doors and a faded American flag out front, she took a deep breath. She'd been coming here for over 30 years. She remembered when Mr. Thompson ran the place, a kind man who always asked about her grandbabies and knew her by name. But he'd retired years ago, and the new staff, well, they changed so often she barely recognized anyone anymore. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and printer ink. A few people waited in line, mostly younger folks on their phones, one older man reading a magazine. She joined the end of the queue, clutching her worn leather wallet like a shield. The teller called, "Next," in a voice that sounded more bored than welcoming. Evelyn stepped forward, smiling politely. "Good morning," she said softly. The young woman behind the counter, blonde, maybe early 20s, with perfectly arched eyebrows and a name tag that read Tiffany, barely looked up. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." $60 from my checking account." Tiffany tapped at her keyboard, then frowned. "ID, please." Evelyn handed over her driver's license without hesitation. She'd done this 100 times. Tiffany took it, glanced at it, then at Evelyn, then back at the screen. Her brow furrowed. Is something wrong?" Evelyn asked, her voice still calm, but a tiny knot forming in her stomach. "Well," Tiffany leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice, but not enough. "This account hasn't had much activity lately, and you're asking for cash. We just need to make sure everything's okay." Evelyn blinked. "Everything's fine. I'm just getting money for groceries." Tiffany nodded slowly, but her eyes narrowed. "Do you live alone, ma'am?" The question caught Evelyn off guard. "Yes. But what does that have to do with—" "It's just," Tiffany interrupted, her tone shifting into something almost pitying. "Sometimes elderly customers get taken advantage of. Scammers call, pretend to be family. We have to be careful." Evelyn felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was confused. Why was this happening? She wasn't acting strange. She wasn't confused. She was standing right here, clear-eyed and polite. "I'm not being scammed," she said firmly. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Tiffany gave a tight smile. "Of course. But bank policy requires us to verify. Can you tell me your mother's maiden name?" Evelyn sighed. She knew the security questions. She'd set them up herself. "Yes, it's Whitmore," Tiffany typed, waited, then shook her head. "That's not matching our records." "That's impossible," Evelyn said, her voice rising just a little. "I've used that answer for years." "Well, maybe you forgot," Tiffany said, shrugging slightly. "It happens." Now Evelyn felt it, the first real sting. Not just inconvenience, but something deeper. Disbelief. Disrespect. like she was being treated like a child who couldn't remember her own history. "I didn't forget," she said, her voice steady but firmer now. "My mother's name was Lillian Whitmore. She was born in 1923. She taught third grade for 42 years. I remember her every single day." A few people in line shifted. One woman glanced over, then quickly looked away. The man with the magazine lowered it slightly, watching. Tiffany's expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but if the security answer doesn't match, I can't process the withdrawal. Maybe you should call your family to help you sort this out." The words landed like a slap. Call your family, as if she were incapable, as if she needed a babysitter to handle $60. "I don't need my family," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but clear. "I need you to do your job." Tiffany's eyes flickered with annoyance. She leaned toward the intercom. "Manager to counter 3, please." Now everyone was definitely watching. Evelyn stood very still, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart pounding not from fear but from the awful feeling of being put on display. She could feel their eyes, curious, judgmental, maybe even embarrassed for her. She wanted to melt into the floor. The manager arrived, a man in a too-tight suit smelling of cheap cologne. He listened to Tiffany's quick summary, then turned to Evelyn with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, voice dripping with false concern, "we're just trying to protect you. These days fraud is everywhere. Maybe it's best if you come back with a family member." "I am the family member," Evelyn said, her voice cracking just a little. "I raised 3 children. I paid off this house. I've banked here since before you were born, and all I want is $60 to buy food." The manager's smile tightened. "I understand, but policy is policy." "Then get me someone who can override it," she said. "Or let me speak to someone who actually knows what they're doing." Tiffany scoffed, just a small sound, but Evelyn heard it. And that's when the real shame hit. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she was being made to feel like she had. Like her age, her skin, her quiet dignity were somehow suspicious. She thought about walking out, just turning around and leaving. But then what? Go home with no groceries? Let them win? So she stayed. She stood there while the manager made a show of checking the system, while Tiffany rolled her eyes at another teller, while the line behind her grew restless. She kept her chin up, but inside, she felt smaller than she had in years. She remembered the time in 1964 when she and her husband tried to open their first joint account. The banker had refused to look her in the eye, insisted all correspondence go to her husband, called her girl, even though she was wearing her teaching badge. She'd fought then too, quietly, persistently, and won. But that was 60 years ago. She thought things had changed. Now standing in this cold, fluorescent-lit bank, she wasn't so sure. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from weakness, she'd survived Jim Crow, raised a family through hard times, buried her love with grace, but from the exhaustion of having to prove, over and over, that she belonged. That she was trustworthy. That she was human. She wanted to cry. Not big sobs, just a few hot tears she could blink away. But she wouldn't. Not here. Not in front of them. So she stood, silent, waiting, and just as the silence stretched thin enough to break, the glass doors behind her whooshed open. A gust of warm air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and city pavement. Footsteps, confident, unhurried, crossed the tile floor. Evelyn didn't turn. She didn't dare hope. But something in the room shifted. The manager straightened his tie. Tiffany stopped typing. Even the people in line seemed to hold their breath. Then a voice, deep, calm, familiar in a way Evelyn couldn't place, said, "Ms. Carter?" She turned, and there he was. A tall man, black like her, maybe in his 50s, dressed in a dark suit that looked expensive but not flashy. His face was kind, his eyes sharp but warm. He wasn't smiling, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only recognition. "You tutored my daughter in reading," he said gently. "Back when she was in third grade at Lincoln Elementary. She still talks about how you helped her love books." Evelyn's breath caught. She did remember. A quiet girl with braids and glasses struggling with chapter books. Evelyn had stayed after school twice a week for a whole semester. The girl had brought her a handmade card at the end. "Thank you for seeing me. I remember her," Evelyn whispered. The man nodded. Then he looked past her, at the manager, at Tiffany, and his expression changed. Not angry, not loud, but firm. like a stone settling into place. "What's going on here?" he asked. The manager stepped forward, suddenly all smiles. "Sir, we're just—" "I asked Ms. Carter," the man interrupted, his voice low but carrying. "Not you." Evelyn swallowed. She looked at him, then at the floor, then back. And for the first time in 20 minutes, she didn't feel alone. "She's trying to withdraw $60, she said, her voice stronger now. "And they won't let her." The man didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, as if filing that information away for later. Then he turned fully to Evelyn, his posture open, respectful. "May I help you with that, Ms. Carter?" She hesitated. Pride warred with relief. But then she remembered her daughter's words from last Sunday's call. "Mama, it's not weakness to accept kindness." So she nodded. "Yes," she said. "I believe you can." And just like that, the air in the bank changed. The shame didn't vanish, it never does, not completely, but it was no longer hers to carry alone, because someone had seen her, really seen her. And that made all the difference. Evelyn stood near the customer service desk, her hands folded tightly in front of her, fingers pressing into the soft leather of her wallet like it might disappear if she let go. The air in the bank felt heavier now, not just cool, but thick, like walking through syrup. She could still hear the echo of that teller's voice, the way she'd said "ma'am," like it was a question, not a courtesy. And that look, the one that said, "You don't belong here unless someone explains you." She tried to steady her breathing. In, out, slow and even, like her doctor taught her after the last blood pressure scare. But her chest felt tight, not from illness, but from something older, deeper. It wasn't just about $60. It never was. Her mind drifted not far, just back a few hours, then a few years, then decades. She remembered walking into this very bank in 1987, right after her husband got his promotion at the post office. They'd come to open a savings account for their youngest's college fund. Back then, the manager, a white man with thinning hair and a pipe, had shaken her husband's hand firmly, then turned to her and said, "And what does your wife do?" As if she were furniture. She'd smiled politely and said, "I teach 3rd grade at Lincoln." He'd blinked, surprised, then laughed like it was a joke. "Well, isn't that sweet?" he'd said. She'd never forgotten it, not because it was the worst thing that ever happened to her, far from it, but because it was so ordinary, so expected. And now, all these years later, here she was again, being treated like she couldn't be trusted with her own money. Like her memory was failing, her judgment clouded, her presence a problem to be managed. She wasn't confused. She wasn't lost. She was standing right here, clear-eyed, dressed in clothes she'd ironed herself, with a mind that still remembered every student she'd ever taught, every recipe her mama passed down, every word of the 23rd Psalm. But none of that seemed to matter when you were an older black woman in a place that only saw your age and your skin. She glanced around. The other customers had gone back to their phones or their magazines, pretending they hadn't just watched her be questioned like a suspect. One young man caught her eye for a second. Maybe he felt bad, but he quickly looked away. That was the worst part sometimes, not the cruelty, but the silence of people who could say something and don't. Her throat tightened. She thought about just leaving. Walking out, going to the grocery store with the few dollars she had in her purse, making do with rice and beans like she had in harder times. But that felt like letting them win, like admitting they were right to doubt her. So she stayed. But inside, she was retreating, pulling into that quiet place she'd built over a lifetime of having to protect herself from small daily cuts. She remembered the time her grandson, maybe 10 years old, came home from school upset because a classmate told him old black ladies were scary. Evelyn had knelt, well, as much as her knees allowed, and looked him in the eye. "Baby," she'd said, "they don't see me. They see a story they've been told, but you know who I am." He'd hugged her tight, and she'd held on, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, feeling the weight of his trust. That moment had carried her for weeks. But today, no one was holding her. No one was saying, I see you. She thought about her husband. Oh, how he would have handled this. He wouldn't have yelled. He wasn't that kind of man. But he'd have stood tall, voice calm but firm, and said something like, "My wife doesn't need your permission to access what's hers." And they would have listened, not because he was loud, but because he carried himself like he knew his worth, and expected others to recognize it too. She missed him more in moments like this, not just his presence, but his shield. A memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. It was 1999. She'd gone to the department store downtown to buy a winter coat. The saleswoman followed her from rack to rack, never offering help, just hovering. When Evelyn finally picked one out, the woman said, "Are you sure you can afford that?" Evelyn had looked her dead in the eye and said, "I've paid cash for houses, honey. I think I can handle a coat." She bought it, wore it for 10 years, and never went back to that store. But she was older now, tired in a way that wasn't just physical, and sometimes the fight felt heavier than the insult. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 10 minutes had passed since that man walked in. She didn't know who he was, really, just that he remembered her, and that he'd spoken to her like she mattered. That small act of recognition had been like a lifeline thrown into rough water. Still, she couldn't shake the shame. It clung to her like damp clothes. She kept replaying the teller's face, the slight curl of her lip, the way she'd sighed like Evelyn was wasting her time. And the manager, with his fake concern, his for your own good tone. They hadn't shouted. They hadn't called her names. But what they'd done was worse in its own way. It was the kind of disrespect that hides behind rules and policies, that pretends to care while stripping you of dignity. She thought about calling her daughter, just to hear a familiar voice, but what would she say? They treated me like I was stupid at the bank. Her daughter would worry, maybe even come down from Atlanta, and Evelyn didn't want that. She didn't want to be a burden. She'd spent her whole life being the strong one, the one others leaned on. Now in her twilight years, she just wanted to move through the world without having to prove she deserved to be here. A soft cough brought her back. The man who'd spoken to her was still nearby, talking quietly with the branch manager. She watched him. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't gesturing wildly. But the manager was nodding rapidly, wiping his brow with a handkerchief, looking more nervous by the second. Whatever this man was saying, it carried weight. Evelyn wondered who he was. Not just his name, she didn't care about that. But what kind of life he'd lived to walk into a place like this and command respect without demanding it. There was a calm in him, a certainty. She recognized it. It was the same quiet strength. She'd tried to teach her students that your value isn't given by others, it's carried within you. But even knowing that didn't always make it easier to feel it. She shifted her weight, her feet aching slightly in her good shoes. She thought about sitting down, but the only chairs were near the entrance, and she didn't want to look like she was giving up. So she stood, straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirt. Small acts of defiance. Then she remembered something her mother used to say. "Child, when folks try to make you small, stand taller. Not for them. For you." So she did. Her mind wandered again, this time to her classroom. 30 years of teaching, rows of desks, chalk dust in the air, the sound of children's voices reading aloud. She'd had students who came from broken homes, who didn't have shoes that fit, who were told they'd never amount to anything, and she'd looked each one in the eye and said, "You are worthy, you are capable, you belong here." She'd believed it for them, even when they didn't believe it for themselves. Now standing in this bank, she wondered, could she believe it for herself? The answer didn't come easy. It never did. But she held on to the memory of that little girl she'd tutored, the one whose father had just walked in. The girl who'd written her that card. "Thank you for seeing me." Maybe that was the point. Maybe being seen was the greatest gift one person could give another. And maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been entirely unseen today. She watched as the man finished speaking to the manager. The manager nodded, then turned and walked quickly toward the back office. The teller, Tiffany, was now staring at her computer screen, avoiding everyone's eyes. The man turned and walked back toward Evelyn, his expression softening as he approached. "Ms. Carter," he said gently, "they're going to process your withdrawal right away. No more questions." She nodded, not trusting her voice. He didn't stop there. "And they'll be reviewing their procedures. This shouldn't have happened." She looked at him then, really looked, saw the lines around his eyes, the silver at his temples, the quiet strength in his posture. He wasn't doing this because he had to. He was doing it because it was right. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't say, "You're welcome," like it was nothing. He held her gaze and said, "It's the least I could do. You changed my daughter's life." And just like that, the knot in her chest loosened a little. But even as relief began to seep in, another feeling rose alongside it. Anger. Not hot and loud, but slow and steady. The kind that builds over a lifetime of being underestimated. She wasn't angry at this man, far from it. She was angry at a world that made moments like this necessary. Angry that a woman her age, with her history, her contributions, her dignity, could be treated like a problem in her own community. She thought about all the other women like her, sitting in waiting rooms, standing in lines, walking into stores, carrying the weight of being seen as less than. Not because they were, but because someone decided they should be. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't just feel tired. She felt ready to speak up, ready to stand firm, ready to remind the world quietly, firmly, that she was still here. Still sharp, still deserving of respect. The teller called her name. "Ms. Carter? We're ready for you." Evelyn took a deep breath. She didn't rush. She didn't shrink. She walked to the counter with the same grace she'd used to walk into her classroom every morning for 30 years. This time, when she handed over her ID, she didn't wait for permission. She looked the teller in the eye and said, $60, please, in small bills. The teller didn't argue, didn't sigh, just nodded and counted out the cash with trembling fingers. As Evelyn took the money, folding it carefully into her wallet, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just about the cash. It was about reclaiming her space, her voice, her worth. She turned to leave but paused when she saw the man still standing there, watching her with quiet respect. "You have a good day." "Ms. Carter," he said. She smiled then, a real one, warm and steady. "You too," she said. "And give my love to your daughter. Tell her Mrs. Carter says to keep reading." "I will," he said, and there was a promise in his voice. She walked out of the bank slowly, not because her legs hurt, but because she wanted to feel every step. The sun was higher now, warming the sidewalk. Birds chirped in the trees. Life went on. But Evelyn felt different, lighter somehow. Not because a stranger had stepped in, though she was grateful, but because she hadn't let the shame win. She'd stood her ground. She'd remembered who she was, and that, she thought as she headed toward the grocery store, was worth more than $60. Still, as she walked, she couldn't shake one thought. What if she hadn't been seen today? What if no one had spoken up? Would she have left empty-handed, carrying that humiliation home like a stone in her pocket? The question lingered, and with it came a new resolve. Maybe it was time she used her voice, not just for herself, but for others who might be standing where she just stood. Maybe her story wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning. She reached the corner store, the one with the friendly clerk who always asked about her garden. As she pushed the door open, a bell jingled overhead. "Morning, Miss Carter," the clerk called out. "Morning, dear," she replied, and this time, her smile reached her eyes. She picked up a basket, selected her items, bread, eggs, milk, a bunch of collard greens, and walked to the counter. When she paid with the crisp bills from the bank, she didn't count them twice. She didn't apologize. She just handed them over with quiet confidence, because she knew, deep in her bones, that she belonged here. And no one, not a teller, not a policy, not a lifetime of quiet slights, could take that away from her again. The man didn't follow her out of the bank right away. Evelyn noticed that as she walked toward the grocery store, his car was still parked near the curb. A sleek black sedan that looked expensive but not flashy, the kind of car someone drives because it's reliable, not because they want to show off. She didn't look back often, but once, just once, she glanced over her shoulder and saw him still inside, talking again with the branch manager, his posture calm but firm, like a tree rooted deep in solid ground. She didn't know who he was, not really. But she knew what he'd done. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't made a scene. He'd simply walked in, recognized her, and refused to let her be treated like a stranger in her own life. That kind of quiet courage stayed with her as she picked out her groceries, as she paid, as she walked back down the sidewalk with her paper bag cradled in her arms like something precious. By the time she reached her front porch, the sun was high and warm on her shoulders, and the shame that had clung to her like a second skin at the bank had mostly faded. Not gone, some things never fully leave, but softened. Like an old bruise that no longer hurts unless you press on it. She set her groceries on the kitchen counter, unpacked them slowly, humming a hymn under her breath the way she always did when she needed to settle her thoughts. As she put the milk in the fridge, her eyes drifted to the small framed photo on the shelf. Her and her husband on their 50th anniversary, both smiling like they'd just shared a secret joke. She touched the glass gently. "I wish you'd been there today," she whispered. But then she shook her head. "No," she said aloud, "you'd have been proud of me." I stood my ground, and she had. Even if it took someone else stepping in to make the bank staff listen, she hadn't walked away. She'd stayed. She'd held her head up. That counted for something. Later that afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen table sipping iced tea and sorting through the mail, there was a soft knock at the door. Not the loud, impatient rap of a delivery person, but a gentle tap. 3 light knocks, polite and measured. Evelyn frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her daughter wasn't due to call until Sunday, and the neighbors usually waved from their yards rather than come knocking. She walked to the door, peering through the peephole. There he was, the man from the bank. He stood on her porch with his hands clasped in front of him, not too close to the door, giving her space. He wore the same suit, but now he held a small paper bag in one hand. Her heart skipped, just a little. Not from fear, she didn't feel afraid of him, but from surprise. Why would he come all the way here? She opened the door slowly, leaving the chain on at first. "Yes?" He smiled, not too wide, just enough to show he meant no harm. "Miss Carter? I hope I'm not intruding. My name is David Langston. I was at the bank this morning." She recognized his voice immediately. She unhooked the chain and opened the door wider. "I remember you. You're the father of that little girl I tutored." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am, Maya. She's in college now, studying literature, thanks to you." Evelyn's face softened. Maya, of course. She had such a quiet mind, but once she found her voice in books, she never stopped. "She still quotes you," he said. "Says you told her that stories are how we learn to see the world through someone else's eyes." Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I did say that, and I still believe it." He shifted slightly, then held out the paper bag. "I was on my way back from a meeting downtown, and I passed by Sweet Olive Bakery. I remembered you mentioning once, years ago, when Maya brought you that thank you card, that you loved their peach cobbler." Evelyn blinked. She hadn't thought about that in years. But yes, she'd written on the back of Maya's card, "Your words warmed my heart more than Sweet Olive's cobbler." But not by much. She'd forgotten she'd even written that. "You remembered that?" she asked, genuinely surprised. He smiled. "Maya kept that card on her bulletin board all through high school. I saw it every time I dropped her off for school." Evelyn looked at the bag, then back at him. "That's very kind of you. Least I could do," he said, "after what happened this morning." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Well, come in then. I'll put on a pot of coffee." He didn't rush in. He waited for her to lead, then followed her into the small, tidy living room. Everything was clean but lived in. The armchair with the crocheted blanket draped over it. The bookshelf filled with well-worn novels and photo albums. The faint scent of lavender and lemon polish in the air. He sat where she pointed, on the sofa, and placed the bakery bag carefully on the coffee table. Evelyn disappeared into the kitchen, and he took the moment to look around, not nosily, but with quiet appreciation. He saw the framed teaching award on the wall, the handmade quilt folded over the back of the couch, the stack of library books on the side table. This was a home built on care, on memory, on dignity. When Evelyn returned with 2 mugs of coffee and a small plate, she set them down and opened the bakery bag. The smell of warm peaches and cinnamon filled the room. "I haven't had this in years," she said, cutting a small slice. They raised their prices, and I decided it wasn't worth it anymore. He took the slice she offered. Sometimes, he said gently, it's worth it just to be reminded that good things still exist. She looked at him over the rim of her mug. You didn't just come here for cobbler, did you? He set his fork down. No, ma'am. I didn't. He took a breath. I sit on the board of the regional banking group that owns that branch. I was actually there this morning for a quarterly review meeting, scheduled weeks ago. I had no idea I'd walk in and see you being treated like that. Evelyn's eyes widened slightly. You're part of the bank? Not in the way you think, he said quickly. I don't manage branches or tellers, but I do help set policies, especially around customer service and community relations. What happened to you today? That's not just bad manners. It's a failure of our system. She stirred her coffee slowly. They said it was policy, protecting elderly customers from fraud. And that's important, he said, but policy shouldn't erase a person's dignity. There's a difference between protection and suspicion. Between care and control. Evelyn nodded. That's exactly it. They didn't ask if I was okay. They assumed I wasn't. He leaned forward slightly. I've already spoken with the regional director. We're launching a mandatory training program for all staff on implicit bias, on elder respect, on how to serve customers without making them feel like suspects. And that branch manager? He's being reassigned. She looked down at her hands. I don't want anyone to lose their job over me. It's not about you, he said gently. It's about accountability. That manager has had 3 similar complaints in the past year, all involving older black customers. This wasn't the first time. It was just the first time someone with enough clout was there to witness it. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Why do you care?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at her small garden, where marigolds bloomed in neat rows. "Because my mother was a woman like you," he said finally. Smart, proud, independent. She lived alone after my father passed. One day she went to the pharmacy to pick up her blood pressure medicine, and the clerk refused to fill it without her daughter present. Said she seemed confused. She wasn't confused. She just didn't have her reading glasses that day. He paused, his voice thickening just a little. She came home and cried. Not because she couldn't get her pills, she went to another pharmacy, but because she felt invisible. Like her whole life, everything she'd built didn't matter anymore. Evelyn reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his. It was a small gesture, but it carried decades of understanding. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded, blinking quickly. She passed last year. But before she did, she told me, "Son, if you ever have the power to make things fairer for folks like me, you do it. Don't wait." He looked at Evelyn then, his eyes clear and steady. "Today I had that chance, and I'm grateful it was you." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the old wall clock and the distant chirp of sparrows outside. The cobbler was sweet, the coffee strong, just the way she liked it. After a while, Evelyn said, "You know, I've thought about speaking up before. Writing a letter, calling the corporate office. But I always talked myself out of it. Don't make trouble, I'd say. You're just one old woman. You're not just anything," he said firmly. "You're a teacher, a community pillar, a woman who shaped lives, including mine, through my daughter." She smiled faintly. "I never thought of it that way." "Well, you should," he said. "And I'd like your help." She raised an eyebrow. "My help?" "Yes," he said. "We're forming a customer advisory council, real people from the community, especially elders and people of color, to review our policies and give honest feedback. No scripts, no corporate speak, just truth." He pulled a small card from his pocket and handed it to her. "I'd be honored if you'd consider joining." Evelyn looked at the card. Plain white, just a name, a phone number, and an email. No title, no fancy logo. "I don't know much about banking," she said. "You know about respect," he said. "You know what it feels like to be seen, and what it feels like not to be. That's more valuable than any finance degree." She turned the card over in her hands. Then she looked up at him. "What would I have to do?" "Meet once a month. Share your thoughts. Tell us when we're getting it wrong. Maybe even visit other branches, not as a customer, but as an observer. Help us build a bank that serves everyone, not just the ones who look like the people behind the counter." She thought about it, really thought. Not just about the time or the effort, but about the meaning. This wasn't just about her. It was about the next Mrs. Carter who walked into that bank scared and proud and just wanting to buy groceries. "I'll do it," she said. He didn't grin or clap. He just nodded like he'd known she would. "Thank you." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. When he stood to leave, he didn't make a big show of it. Just stood, straightened his jacket, and said, "I'll be in touch soon." At the door, she stopped him. "David." He turned. "Tell Maya. Tell her I'm proud of her, and that I still believe stories can change the world." "I will," he said. "And Ms. Carter, yes?" "Thank you for not walking away today," she smiled. "I'm learning not to." He nodded, then walked down the porch steps and back to his car. Evelyn watched him go, then closed the door softly. She went back to the kitchen, washed the mugs, put the leftover cobbler in the fridge. Then she sat at the table again, the small card resting in her palm. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like just an old woman waiting out her days. She felt like someone who still had work to do, and that, she thought as she tucked the card into her recipe box, right between her cornbread recipe and her husband's favorite stew, was a good feeling. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and fireflies began to blink in her garden, Evelyn picked up the phone. She dialed her daughter's number. "Hey, Mama," her daughter answered, voice bright with surprise. "Everything okay?" "Yes, baby," Evelyn said. "Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually." She didn't tell her about the bank, not yet. Not because she was ashamed, but because she wanted to tell the whole story when it was finished, when it had a proper ending. Instead, she said, "I just wanted to hear your voice." They talked about the grandkids, about the weather, about a new church potluck coming up. Normal things. Good things. But as Evelyn hung up, she felt something new stirring inside her. Not just peace, but purpose. The world hadn't changed overnight. Banks would still have policies. People would still carry their biases, hidden or not. But today something had shifted. Not just in that bank, but in her. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't forgotten, and she wasn't done yet. She walked out onto the porch, sat in her rocking chair, and watched the stars come out one by one. The night was warm, the air soft with the scent of jasmine from her garden. Somewhere down the street a child laughed. A dog barked. Life went on, and Evelyn Carter, retired teacher, widow, proud black woman, sat tall in her chair, sipping sweet tea, knowing that her voice still mattered, and that was enough, for now. The first meeting of the Customer Advisory Council was held in a small conference room on the third floor of the bank's downtown headquarters, a place Evelyn had never imagined she'd step into. She wore her best dress, the deep green one with the lace collar her daughter had given her for Christmas, and her pearl earrings. Not to impress anyone, but because she believed how you showed up mattered. If you walked in like you belonged, people had no choice but to treat you like you did. She arrived 10 minutes early, as she always did for anything important. The receptionist, a young woman with warm brown skin and a kind smile, recognized her from the photo David had sent around. "Ms. Carter, we've been expecting you. Mr. Langston said to send you right up." Evelyn nodded, clutching her handbag like a shield. Though her hands weren't shaking this time, she took the elevator alone, watching the floor numbers climb, her reflection in the polished metal doors looking older but steady. When the doors opened, David was waiting for her. "You came," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement. "I said I would," she replied. He led her down a hallway lined with framed photos of community events, food drives, school partnerships, financial literacy workshops. She noticed something right away. In nearly every photo, the bank employees were smiling with people who looked like them, young, mostly white, professional. But in the newer ones, there were more faces like hers. Elders, black families, immigrants holding their children's hands. "They've been making changes," David said, following her gaze. "Slowly, but it's starting." The conference room was already half full. About 10 people sat around a long table, some older, some younger, a mix of races and backgrounds. One woman used a walker. A man in his 60s had a hearing aid. A young Latina mother held a baby in a carrier at her feet. No suits, no name tags, just regular folks. Looking a little nervous, a little hopeful, David introduced Evelyn simply. "This is Ms. Carter. She's been teaching in this community for over 30 years, and she knows what respect looks like. No fanfare, no exaggeration, just truth." Evelyn liked that. She took her seat and the meeting began not with PowerPoints or policy jargon, but with a question. Tell us a time you felt truly seen or truly unseen by a bank. One by one, people shared. A veteran talked about being denied a small loan to fix his roof, even though he had perfect credit, because the loan officer didn't understand military pensions. A young black man said he'd been followed through the lobby every time he came in, even when he was just checking his balance. An older Asian woman spoke through a translator about how no one ever offered her forms in her language, so she'd stopped using the bank altogether. Evelyn listened, her heart aching with each story. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns, and patterns could be changed if people were willing to see them. When it was her turn, she didn't tell the whole bank story right away. Instead, she said, I've been coming to that branch on Elm Street since 1989. I've deposited paychecks, saved for my children's college, paid off my home. I know the tellers' names, the janitor's schedule, the way the light hits the floor at 3 p.m. But this month, for the first time, I was made to feel like a stranger in my own history. She paused. They didn't ask if I needed help. They asked if I was being scammed, as if a lifetime of responsibility could be erased by one gray hair. No one spoke for a moment. Then the woman with the walker said, That's exactly it. They treat us like we've forgotten who we are, when really they've forgotten who we are. David didn't take notes like a boss. He listened like a student. And when the sharing ended, he didn't offer empty promises. He said, This is why you're here. Not to fix everything today, but to help us see what we've been blind to. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn attended more meetings. She visited other branches, not as a customer, but as an observer. She'd sit in the waiting area with a book, watching how staff greeted people, how long elders waited, whether anyone offered help without being asked. She took quiet notes in a small spiral notebook, not to catch people doing wrong, but to understand where kindness could grow. One afternoon, she went to a branch in a mostly black neighborhood on the east side of town. The place was clean but worn, the carpet frayed, the chairs mismatched. Yet the atmosphere was warm. The teller, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked braids, called every customer by name. She helped an older man fill out a deposit slip without making him feel slow. She laughed with a young mother about her toddler's antics. Afterward, Evelyn asked David why this branch felt different. Because the manager grew up here, he said. She hired people from the neighborhood. She knows these customers not as accounts, but as neighbors. That's the secret, isn't it? Evelyn said. Knowing people. It is, he agreed. But it's hard to scale that when corporate thinks in numbers, not names. So teach them, Evelyn said simply, and that's what they started to do. Evelyn suggested something small but powerful, a customer story wall in every branch. Not photos of executives, but short notes from real people, written in their own words about what the bank meant to them. One read, This is where I opened my first savings account for my daughter. She's in med school now. Another, After my husband passed, the teller here remembered his name and asked how I was doing. That meant more than money. David loved the idea. Within a month, the first wall went up at the Elm Street branch, the very one where Evelyn had been shamed. She went to see it on a quiet Tuesday morning. The branch was different now. Softer lighting, a water pitcher with lemon slices on the counter, a sign that read, Ask us how we can help, no question is too small. And there, near the entrance, was the story wall. Dozens of index cards pinned to a corkboard, each one a tiny act of humanity. She saw her own card, though she hadn't written it herself. David had added it with her permission. Ms. Carter has banked here for 35 years. She taught generations of children to read. Today she teaches us to see. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. Not from sadness, from pride. Not in herself, but in what was possible when people chose to listen. Then something unexpected happened. As she stood there, a young teller, the same one who'd questioned her that day, approached. Her name tag still said Tiffany, but her eyes were different. Less guarded. More humble, Miss Carter, she said, voice low. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Evelyn turned slowly. For what exactly? For treating you like you didn't belong. For making you feel small. I didn't realize. I didn't see you. Evelyn studied her face. She saw no performative guilt, just real regret. Why now? Evelyn asked. Because I read your story on the wall. And I thought about my grandmother. She's your age. And if someone ever treated her like that. Tiffany's voice cracked. I'd want someone to stand up for her too. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched the girl's arm. Just a light touch, but full of meaning. Apology accepted, she said. But don't just be sorry. Be better. Tiffany nodded, eyes glistening. I will. That small exchange stayed with Evelyn all the way home. It wasn't about forgiveness for its own sake. It was about opening a door so someone else could walk through it with more care. A few days later, David called. We're rolling out the new staff training next month, he said. And we'd like you to help lead the session on elder respect. Evelyn laughed softly. Me, I'm not a trainer. You're a teacher, he said. That's exactly what we need. So she agreed. On the day of the training, she stood in front of 20 bank employees, young tellers, loan officers, managers, at the main training center. She didn't wear a suit. She wore her lavender blouse, the one she'd had on that day at the bank. A quiet reminder, she didn't lecture. She told stories. She talked about Mrs. Jenkins down the street, who walks 3 blocks every week to deposit her pension because she doesn't trust online banking, but she trusts the people. She talked about Mr. Thompson, who lost his wife last year and comes in just to talk to someone who remembers her name. She talked about herself, about how being questioned wasn't about the money, but about being made to feel like her life didn't count. Then she asked them a question. When an older customer walks in, what do you see first? Their age, or their humanity? No one answered right away. Then a young man in the back said, I see my grandma. Evelyn smiled. Good, start there. After the session, several employees came up to thank her. One woman said, I never thought about how my tone might sound condescending. I'll pay attention now. Another said, my mom's been scammed before. I get why we have to be careful, but I see now that protection shouldn't feel like punishment. That evening, Evelyn sat on her porch again, the same as always. But something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just reacting to what had happened to her. She was helping shape what would happen next. A week later, she got a letter in the mail, not from the bank, but from a woman she'd never met. The handwriting was shaky but clear. Dear Ms. Carter, it read, I heard about what you did at the bank. I'm 82, and last month I was treated the same way. Asked if my son knew I was withdrawing money. I almost didn't go back, but then I read about you in the community newsletter. So I went in again, and this time the teller called me ma'am with respect. She even helped me sign up for text alerts so I can track my account. Thank you for giving me the courage to try again. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it in her recipe box, right beside David's card. She realized then that this wasn't just about policy changes or training sessions. It was about ripple effects. One act of courage, hers, David's, even Tiffany's apology, could touch lives she'd never meet. One afternoon, as she was watering her marigolds, David stopped by again. This time he wasn't in a suit. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop down the street. Thought you might like a break, he said, handing her one. She took it, smiling. You keep showing up with treats. People will talk. Let them, he said, leaning against her porch railing. I came to tell you the regional director approved your idea for community listening days. Once a month, bank staff will host open hours at local senior centers, churches, even barbershops, just to hear what people need. Evelyn's eyes lit up. They said yes? They did. And they want you to help design it. She shook her head in wonder. I never thought. I just wanted to be treated fairly. And now you're helping make sure others are too, he said. That's how change starts, not with grand speeches, but with one person saying, this isn't right, and another saying, I'll stand with you. They sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee, watching the sun dip behind the oak trees. Then Evelyn said, You know, I used to think my teaching days were over when I retired. And now? He asked. Now I think I'm just teaching a different classroom, she said. One where the lesson is everyone deserves to be seen. He smiled. Best lesson there is. As he drove away, Evelyn went back inside and opened her notebook. On a fresh page, she wrote, Ideas for Listening Day. Start with stories, not forms. Bring cookies. Remember names, she wasn't done. Not by a long shot, and for the first time in years, she felt excited about what came next because dignity wasn't just something you were owed. It was something you could give. One kind word, one fair glance, one honest conversation at a time. And Evelyn Carter, retired teacher, proud black woman, quiet force of grace, was ready to keep giving it, long after the bank doors closed for the day. The first community listening day was held at the Maplewood Senior Center on a bright Saturday morning in early spring. Evelyn arrived early carrying a basket of homemade banana bread wrapped in a checkered cloth, her mother's recipe, the one she always used when she wanted to make people feel welcome. She wore a simple cotton dress, comfortable shoes, and her pearl earrings. Not for show, but because she believed showing up with care mattered, even in small things. The room was already filling. Not just elders, but neighbors. Young parents with strollers, church deacons, small business owners who'd heard about the event through word of mouth. A few bank staff members were there too, not behind desks or in uniforms, but in plain clothes, setting up folding chairs and pouring coffee from big thermoses. They looked nervous, but trying. Evelyn liked that. Trying was the first step. She didn't stand at the front like a speaker. She sat in the circle just like everyone else. When David arrived, he did the same. No podium, no microphone. Just people sitting together. The idea was simple: talk. Not about interest rates or account types, but about trust. About what it felt like to walk into a bank and wonder if you'd be treated like a person or a problem. An older man named Mr. Ellis spoke first. He'd worked as a mechanic for 40 years, saved every penny, but said he'd stopped going to the bank after a teller once asked if his grandson was helping him with his money. His voice shook. Not from anger, but from the hurt of being seen as less. A young woman with 2 toddlers, clinging to her legs, said she'd been denied a small loan to fix her car, even though she had steady work because she used a government assistance card for groceries. They saw the card, she said quietly, and forgot I'm also a nurse who works nights. One by one, stories spilled out, not as complaints, but as truths. And the bank staff didn't defend. They listened, took notes, asked gentle questions. What would have helped in that moment? How could we have done better? Evelyn watched it all, her heart full in a way she hadn't expected. This wasn't about fixing one bank. It was about rebuilding something deeper. Connection. After the circle ended, people lingered, shared coffee, ate a banana bread, laughed over old neighborhood memories. One teller sat with Mrs. Jenkins, Evelyn's neighbor, and helped her set up mobile alerts on her phone, her voice patient, her hands slow and steady. No rush, no judgment. As Evelyn packed up her basket, David came over. You did it, he said softly. I didn't do anything, she replied. I just showed up. That's the thing, he said. So many people stop showing up when they're hurt. But you didn't, and because of that, others feel safe to speak too. She looked around the room, at the quiet conversations, the exchanged phone numbers, the way a young bank employee was carefully writing down an elder's suggestion about larger print forms. This was what change looked like. Not loud, not instant, but real. Over the next few months, the listening days spread to churches, community centers, even the local library. Each time Evelyn came, not as a leader, but as a presence, a reminder that dignity wasn't a privilege for the young or the powerful. It was a right for everyone. Then came the invitation. It arrived in a plain envelope, but the letter inside was anything but ordinary. The city council wanted Evelyn to speak at their annual Community Unity Forum, a gathering of local leaders, business owners, and residents. The theme this year, honoring the voices that shape us. She almost said no. Public speaking had never been her thing. She'd taught children, not crowds, but David encouraged her. They don't need a speech, he said. They need your truth. So she agreed. The night of the forum, the high school auditorium was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled with faces she recognized. Neighbors, former students, shopkeepers, even the young teller from the bank sitting near the back. Evelyn stood backstage, her hands folded, breathing slowly. She wasn't nervous about the words. She was nervous about failing the moment. When her name was called, she walked out not with a script but with her notebook, the same one she'd used for grocery lists and bank observations. She stood at the mic, looked out at the sea of faces, and began not with a grand statement but with a question. How many of you have ever felt invisible? Hands rose, slowly at first, then more. Young, old, black, white, brown. Not everyone, but enough. I'm 78 years old, she said. I've lived in this town longer than most of the buildings downtown. I've taught your children, baked pies for your fundraisers, voted in every election since 1964. And yet, a few months ago, I stood in a bank I've used for 35 years and was treated like I didn't belong. She didn't name the bank, didn't shame the teller. She told the story simply, how the doubt in their eyes made her doubt herself if only for a moment. But here's what I learned, she said, her voice growing stronger. Being seen isn't about other people changing their minds. It's about refusing to let their blindness dim your light. She spoke about the power of small kindnesses, the clerk who remembered your name, the neighbor who waved every morning, the stranger who said, I see you. She talked about how real change doesn't start in boardrooms but in living rooms, on porches, in bank lobbies where someone chooses to speak up. And it doesn't take a hero, she said. It takes a human being who says this isn't right and then does something, even if it's just staying in the room when you want to leave. When she finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat. Then applause. Not polite clapping, but a wave of sound that rose from the back, from the front, from people standing, eyes wet, nodding like she'd named something they'd all felt but couldn't say. Afterwards, strangers came up to her. Teens, elders, shop owners, thanking her, sharing their own stories. A young man said, My grandma went through the same thing. I'm going to take her to the next listening day. A woman whispered, You gave me courage to speak up at my job. Evelyn didn't feel like a celebrity. She felt like herself, just a woman who'd finally said what needed saying. A week later, the local paper ran a small feature. Retired teacher helps bank rebuild trust. One conversation at a time. There was a photo of her at the listening day, laughing with Mrs. Jenkins' banana bread between them. She cut it out and taped it to her fridge. But the real victory came quietly. One afternoon, as she walked to the post office, she passed the bank on Elm Street. Through the glass doors, she saw something new. A small table near the entrance with a sign that read, Ask me about our community stories. Behind it sat Tiffany, the same teller who'd once questioned her, now wearing a different expression. Open, calm, present. She was talking with an older man, showing him something on a tablet, smiling as he nodded. Evelyn didn't go in. She didn't need to. She just stood for a moment watching. Then she kept walking, a small smile on her lips. Change wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 small choices, like choosing to listen, to apologize, to try again. Back at home, she found an envelope in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a check, not large but meaningful, and a note. In honor of your husband and in gratitude for your courage, we're starting a small scholarship for local students who love reading. Please consider naming it. It was signed by David and a group of community members, including several former students and bank staff. Evelyn held the check in her hands, tears welling. Her husband had always believed in education. He'd worked extra shifts so their kids could go to college. This was his dream living on. She called David that evening. I'd be honored, she said. Let's call it the See Me Scholarship, because every child deserves to be seen for who they are. He agreed without hesitation. The first recipient was a quiet girl from Lincoln Elementary, the same school where Evelyn had taught, the same school where she'd tutored Maya all those years ago. The girl loved poetry and wanted to be a librarian. At the small award ceremony held in the school library, she read a poem she'd written. They told me my voice was too soft, my dreams too small, but Ms. Carter said, Speak anyway. So I do. Evelyn sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her heart so full it ached. She didn't say much afterward, just hugged the girl and whispered, Keep reading. Keep writing. The world needs your voice. That night, as she sat on her porch under a sky full of stars, she thought about everything that had happened since that awful morning at the bank. It hadn't been easy. There were still days when she felt tired, when the world felt heavy. But she no longer felt alone. She'd learned something important. Power wasn't just in titles or offices or bank accounts. Real power was in the courage to stand tall when you're made to feel small, in the choice to speak up not for glory but for justice, in the quiet act of showing up, again and again, for what's right. and she'd learned that dignity wasn't something you waited for someone to give you. It was something you carried inside like a flame, and sometimes you used it to light the way for others. Her phone rang. It was her daughter. "Mama, I saw the article," she said, voice thick with pride. "You're famous," Evelyn chuckled. "I'm not famous, baby. I'm just doing what's right." "Well, it matters," her daughter said. "To me, to your grandkids, to everyone who saw you and thought, if she can do it, so can I." Evelyn looked out at her garden where the marigolds bloomed bright orange in the moonlight. "That's all I ever wanted," she said softly, "for someone to feel a little braver because of me." She hung up, sipped her tea, and rocked gently in her chair. The night was quiet, peaceful, full of the hum of crickets and the distant sound of a train whistle. Life going on, and Evelyn Carter, retired teacher, widow, proud black woman, quiet force of grace, sat tall in her chair, not because the world had finally seen her, but because she'd never stopped seeing herself, and that, she knew, was the truest kind of power there was. In the weeks that followed, the See Me scholarship grew. Local businesses donated. Former students sent notes of support. Even the bank matched every dollar, not as publicity, but as promise. Evelyn didn't manage the fund. She wasn't interested in paperwork, but she met every recipient. She'd invite them for tea, ask about their dreams, tell them stories about her classroom days. She never gave advice unless asked. She just listened, and in listening, she honored them. One day, as she was sorting mail, she found a letter from the regional banking group. It was formal but warm. They were renaming their annual Community Service Award, the Evelyn Carter Dignity and Service Award. The first recipient would be Tiffany, for her work redesigning the elder customer experience. Evelyn read it twice, then placed it in her recipe box, right beside the cobbler receipt, the apology letter, the scholarship note. She didn't keep these things because she was proud of herself. She kept them because they were proof that one moment of shame could become a lifetime of change. That one act of courage could ripple outward, touching lives she'd never meet, and most of all, that no one was ever too old, too quiet, or too ordinary to make a difference. As summer turned to fall, Evelyn kept her routine. Morning coffee, afternoon walks, Sunday calls with her children. But now, when she passed the bank, she didn't feel tension in her shoulders. She felt peace because she knew the truth now. Deep in her bones. Her worth had never been in question. It was always there. And all she had to do was stand tall enough for the world to see it. And in doing so, help others stand tall too.